Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 3 years, I've interviewed over 200 people around this question, not to prescribe a universal answer, but to help you to find and define your own answer to this question. I'm hoping the guests' musings, explorations, anecdotes, and curiosities will prompt your own inquiry into what this question means for you. While I'm also trying to share with you what I perceive to be more genuine expressions of the human experience and indeed more meaningful conversations. Which brings us to this week and the 87th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Dr. Niobe Way. Niobe is Professor of Developmental Psychology at NYU, founder of the Project for the Advancement of Our Common Humanity, and the Principal Investigator of the Listening Project, which fosters curiosity and connections across schools in New York City. Niobe has served as president of the Society for Research on Adolescence, holds a BA from UC Berkeley, a doctorate from the Graduate School of Education from Harvard, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Institute for Mental Health at Yale University. With nearly 40 years of experience researching adolescent social and emotional development, Niobe has authored or co-authored over 100 peer-reviewed articles. She is the author of Deep Secrets, Boys' Friendships, and the Crisis of Connection, and her latest book, Rebels with a Cause, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves, and Our Culture. In this illuminating conversation, Niobe explores what it means to be human and how this is shaped by cultural context, the clash between our nature and culture, and the importance of listening to stories as well as examining the data. She highlights the dangers of living in a culture that is no longer listening and how much of what is needed for greater connection already exists within us. If your relationships lack the depth and connection that you're longing for, if you are struggling to cultivate greater intimacy and curiosity in your life, Niobe offers a wealth of insights, anecdotes, and even exercises for you to consider and practice to reveal your innate capacities for connection. Look, I took so much from this conversation. Niobe is a fountain of insight and wisdom, and she's pointing to hugely important components of our society to be aware of in our own attempts to create our own good life. So I suspect you're going to take a lot from this conversation. And if you enjoy this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. And if you're on the podcasting platforms, please continue to leave your lovely reviews, as I greatly appreciate at this stage of my podcasting journey. Please check out the show notes below for ways of following Niobe's work and for checking out her latest book, and also for ways of contacting me, whether that's working with me individually for your own lines of self-inquiry, taking part in my weekly silent conversation groups, or if you're looking to create greater trust, connection, and communication amongst your teams. You can also find a link to the podcast newsletter where you can read about the reflections that these conversations that you're listening to have evoked in me. So that's all I have to say for this week. I look forward to carrying on the conversation with you next week. And so without further ado, the 87th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Niobe, thank you so much for joining me on the What is a Good Life podcast today. Since being made aware of your work earlier this year, I've been really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here, Mark. Thank you.
So as I have told you, Niobe, the first question, as I tend to kick these things off with, is the question of, is there a question you're trying to answer as you move through life?
Yeah, there is. I'm all driven by questions. That's me. That's my work. Um, yeah, so I would say I have what I call small questions and big questions, and a lot of both actually. But the biggest question I have that has driven me since I was a teenager, because I saw it in my early writings when I was in high school, is the fascination about what it means to be human and how that is shaped by our cultural context. And so, not sort of just in the natural sense, what does it mean to be human in a natural sense? How do we come into the world naturally? Which is why I'm a developmental psychologist, because I'm fascinated by what do we learn from children about what it means to be human. But also, what do we learn about how our nature interacts and what I'm arguing in my new book clashes with our culture, which is a culture of beliefs and practices. And by culture, I don't just mean whether we use forks or chopsticks. I mean whether how we think about the world, how we think about ourselves, how we think about what's important in the world, and those beliefs and practices that are infused, that are both at the local level by country, but they're also macro level by Western ideology or Western and Eastern ideology. So patriarchy, for example, is culture. even though you see it, it's not just specific to one country, it's specific to the world. And capitalism is another one. And so I'm fascinated by how these ideologies of, I'll just use capitalism and patriarchy for the moment, shape our experience of being human. And ultimately, as you know from my book, I ask the question, um, what happens when we live in a culture that clashes with our nature? Which is what I'm arguing in Rebels, that we currently do live in a culture I call boy culture. We can talk about it later. That actually clashes with our human nature and creates a crisis of connection, the consequences of which are violence, and the solutions we'll talk about. But the bigger question is that it got me to that finding through my research over 40 years, is really being driven by a fascination with us as a species, as an animal species, and then how we're shaped by what's around us and the beliefs of people that's around us, and how that shapes how we see ourselves and each other. I know I gave you many questions there, but I
Oh
just,
no, this is
these are
this
all,
is music to my ears.
yeah, yeah,
Numerous avenues have opened up in front of me.
yeah,
So just the could you just go back to the initial sense though of like even as a teenager then
yeah,
you were keenly observing humans, you could sense that in your
yeah,
writings at the time. Can you even
yeah.
just give me a little sense of that?
Yeah, so I was born in Paris, France, and my first language was French. And then we moved to the United States, and I moved to a small, I lived in New York City for a little bit, and then my parents moved to Oberlin College. And Oberlin, where I spent a lot of my adolescence, is really important in what drove my question. So Oberlin is a town, I talk about it in the book, I think you probably saw it, The Thin and Thick Story. So the thin story of Oberlin is it's a very, you may not know this given your own European orientation, but Oberlin is seen as sort of a liberal college. It was the first college to accept women and Black people into its college in the 1830s. So my mother was a professor there. And it's 50% at the time when I was growing up, it was 50% Black and 50% white. But there was a lot of segregation. Black people, for the most part, non-affiliated with the college, lived outside of the town. Oberlin and its faculty and kids of faculty lived in the center of town. And that, I think, honestly, Mark, that observation of these two stories that were going on, that Oberlin is a sort of this enlightened college campus that was progressive, that was, forward thinking, even in the 70s when I was growing up, um, somehow also had this lived experience of actually a lot of racial segregation, a lot of racism, a lot of classism against lower income white people too, not just Black people, with the elites being me and my family and our peers. A lot of classism, sexism, racism going on in Oberlin. And to me, I remember as a teenager, Mark, in high school, I was friends with both the kid on all sides, because I've always been a very friendly person. So I was, and also fascinated by different experiences than my own. So I was friends with all sorts of kids in high school. And so I crossed lines, and just the shock of how rare that was, that people crossed lines, they stayed within their own group. And I wanted to know why. Why do people stay within their own group? Why are they afraid of friendships that cross social class, racial lines? Like what's the fear about? And then this was a big moment for me. And then when I was a sophomore in high school, my parents got divorced, and we moved to California, and I went to a high school that's affiliated with Stanford. My stepfather was at Stanford, and I went to a school that was basically all white. And I have to joke because now I have kind of blonde hair, but it's not natural. Um, it's they were all blonde. I mean, I'm stereotyping, but this was my impression, right? They were blonde white kids, rich, rich kids. I'd never met rich kids like that, and they were all blonde and they were all white in my view of it. And I was used to a very diverse school, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember showing them my boyfriend at the time, Charles, who was Black. And I remember seeing their reaction when they said, "Oh, you have a boyfriend?" And I said, "Yeah, I have a boyfriend." So I showed them a picture of Charles. And I just remember them all looking at each other and looking down. They didn't say anything. They just all looked at each other and looked down. And I really remember that moment, Mark. It's funny because it was a long time ago. It's probably, what was it? It was probably late 70s, early 80s. And I just remember that. Why? I wondered. Said, why are they not wanting to engage with me about seeing my Black boyfriend? I didn't understand why. So that in some ways led me to sort of be fascinated by what I call the thin and thick story. The thin story of sort of what we tell ourselves. Stanford is seen as a very enlightened community, of course, also. All these kids had parents, I'm sure, that were perceived as progressive. These were the early stages of the tech industry and their kids. And so the idea is that I'm sure we were all identified as progressive, but somehow they couldn't tolerate this sort of thing about, that I had a Black boyfriend. And the other thing, which is hilarious, which is relevant, I'll tell you why. I remember getting the questions, are there telephones in Oberlin? And I remember like looking at them like, wait a minute, you think we don't have telephones in Oberlin? Like, what? like, this must have been like 1979 or something. I mean, meaning not, well, I'm not talking about like 1942,
Right.
like this was like, and I remember thinking, oh, they thought Oberlin was like rural. And if you're in rural America, you somehow must not have telephones yet. I mean, just my point, Mark, just the disconnection across worlds. And the thin stories that they're progressive, and the thick stories, they don't have a clue about what's going on with people that are different from themselves. So that really led me to go to UC Berkeley in college. I became very interested in the anti-apartheid movement at college, to divest in South Africa, when I was in college in the mid 80s. And then I sort of began this whole trajectory of listening to poor and working class boys and girls of color, most primarily, initially interested in why aren't we telling stories of poor and working class kids in our stories of humans? So that was my first contribution. Is my dissertation at Harvard was focused on, called Everyday Courage, about trying to bring in the stories of poor and working class kids into our understanding of what it means to be human. That what it means to be human until then, Mark, was almost all white American kids from middle class families, almost all, with some European kids, mostly from England, defining what it means to be human. And I wanted to bring in poor and working class kids into what it means to be human. We can learn from them too about being human. And then began my whole thing, which I began to hear about friendships from these young men of color. And I was mind blown that my field of developmental psychology wasn't talking about friendship, still isn't for the most part. By the way, still isn't. And certainly wasn't talking about what boys of color and young men of, from poor and working class families can offer us about understanding ourselves. And so eventually, I became fascinated by this friendship pattern. Then I spent the next gazillion years, decades, doing these studies of what in the field is called social emotional development. And I've always looked at all kids. I haven't always just looked at boys and men. I've never just looked at boys and young men. I've always looked at all kids. But the boys and young men, and again, I have to emphasize, these are mostly poor and working class boys and young men of color, teach us profound things about, remind us, and even I would even say remind us about what it means to be human, our desire for relationships, our desire for deep depth friendships, deep secret friendships. And also they teach us what is getting in the way, which is these masculine ideologies that say, close friendships are girly and gay and all those kinds of things that get in the way of boys and young men's friendships. And then my newest book, I realized they weren't just telling a story about boys and men. They were telling a story about everybody. So all humans living in modern culture, which I call boy culture because it's the privileging of the hard over the soft, which boys teach me about, the way the hard and the soft is privilege. And mass shooters teach me about the hierarchy of humans, where we value some humans over others, and they're pissed off about it, which is, I can talk about if you're interested. But the idea is that I started off with a sort of investigation of why are we, in some ways, why aren't we also, why isn't everybody curious about each other? Why are we only wanting to connect to people that look like us, and that have had similar experiences? And what's the fear about? And then secondly, what can we add in terms of our understanding of human by adding in people who've never been listened to? And to me, that's driven my work. Both those angles have driven my work since I was a child.
There's first of all, just it's kind of staggering to me that friendship is such an undercovered or understudied element of it,
Yeah,
and also I don't know what honestly contributes to almost in the biggest way to my sense of a good life is intimacy in relationships, and that's with my wife, my best friends, male, female
yeah,
friends, whatever,
yeah,
like, and just the sense of that's almost what brings me aliveness. Like
yeah,
it's being willing to be intimate with another human being.
yeah, yeah,
Where do you think we've and because I'm interested, you also mentioned at the start the sense of the clashing between almost what it
yeah,
naturally means to be human, and when we
yeah,
come up against the clashes with our
yeah,
culture.
yeah,
What do you think almost what has hidden that from us to the extent that
yeah.
it's not so widely discussed?
Yeah, no, so I'm thank you for asking the question, because it really allows me to get to the heart of rebels. It's basically, we don't see the waters in which we swim. So the waters in which we swim, right? The waters in which we swim is boy culture. And by boy, I'm going to tell you specifically, because people initially, it sounds anti-boy. It's not. It's actually comes from what we learned from boys. Boy culture in quotations. Boy culture isn't in quotation. Boy is in quotation, because it's not a real boy. It's a cartoon boy who only values his hard side and doesn't have a soft side. That's a caricature. That's a stereotype. That's a cartoon superhero character. That's not a real boy. But the whole culture is boy culture, privileging the hard over the soft. And this is how I'm going to answer your question. In such a culture, friendships are seen as soft. And I'll tell you other things that are seen as soft that are not studied in my field of human development. Friendships. I mean, there's lots of studies of friendships. What I'm talking about is respective to all the other topics, right, in the field, peer,
Right.
the way peers get in the way. There's certainly studies of friendship. So I'm not going to say there's no studies. What I'm going to say is there are less studies of friendships than there are of peers, which is odd, because peers is focused on how to not have bad peers, not peer pressure, et cetera. But also, when you look at studies of friendships, it's almost always survey studies of how close you are, how not close you are, blah, blah. Do you have them? Do you not have them? They're never looking at qualitatively the meaning of them, and how different people define intimacy, and how different experiences of intimacy. I mean, when people always say Deep Secrets, my first book on boys' friendships, um, how did you get the boys to talk like that? These deeply powerful quotes about the meaning of their friendships. I said, I didn't do anything. My team and I didn't do anything. We just asked the question. Nobody has ever asked them the question to talk about their friendships, the meaning of they've never been asked. So it's not that we did some magic potion to get them to talk in an emotional way. Nobody's ever asked them the question. So the idea is, when we look at friendships, it's very, very, it's quantitative. Remember the hard over the soft. We quantify human experience because we as psychologists want to be a hard science, not a soft science. So we put it into numbers. Once you put it into numbers, you're not understanding much. You're understanding how many, but imagine a whole world, which is what we've created in psychology for the most part, with some exceptions, a world of quantification to describe humans, how much they do things, how much they have something, how often they do something. I mean, it's not about the meaning of it. So when I say there's no investigators of friendships, what I really mean is there's no investigation of the meaning of it for a life, a meaning of it in a life, how they think about it, how they get through conflict. What are good friendships? What are not so good friendships? How do you find a good friend? I mean, all those things have been, for the most part, uninvestigated or underinvestigated in psychology. And it's partly because, it's not partly, I'm going to correct that. It's largely because it's seen as a soft topic. And I'm going to follow up, Mark, because I'm very, very frustrated with my field about this. And the method of listening to words is seen as soft. So not only is the topic perceived as soft, But the method I'm suggesting you have to use to get at the meaning of it is considered soft, meaning words are considered soft, numbers are considered hard, right? Hard data versus soft data. So sometimes my research, which is empirical, federally funded, I'm funded by the National Science Foundation, is oftentimes seen as not science because I deal in words. I'm just saying how crazy boy culture is. So numbers are privilege over words, thinking over feeling, counting over asking what someone means by that. I mean, all those hard over soft, and romantic relationships, weirdly enough, are seen as hard, right? In terms of what you need in life, because you need to produce children in a very heteronormative world. And friendships are seen as what you extraneous, and that mostly girls and women want them anyway. And they're not, they're lower on the hierarchy of humanness. So the idea is it really is a boy culture that privileges all things we've deemed hard and necessary, and and devaluing and mocking of all things that are soft. The second topic I want to pick on, that's because it's deemed soft. This is going to stun you, Mark. Because it seems soft, we do not study it in human development, is interpersonal curiosity. When we study curiosity, we study intellectual curiosity, the curiosity about the external world. We do not study, and think how deep this is, Mark. We do not study our human capacity, our 5-year-old capacity to look at you, Mark, with a sense of wonder and wonder about what you think and feel and what your experiences are. Not only can I learn about you, but I can learn about me through you. I can learn about me through you. We don't value it. We don't study it. We don't take it seriously. We see it as girly. We even equate it with gossip, and gossip and a sense of wonder have nothing to do with each other. So the idea is we just proposed to the National Science Foundation to do the very first study, longitudinal study of interpersonal curiosity, which is the curiosity about another person's thoughts and feelings. I mean, I'm only laughing because it's like, no wonder we have a crisis of connection. We're a culture that doesn't even value my curiosity in another person. We don't even value that. And at the root of all connection is that curiosity.
But I think there's a couple of things you've brought up there that are deeply connected within that. Like, in order to be really curious about the being of another person, listening is
Yeah.
almost the gateway into that. Like,
Yeah.
even if it's the what what part of the word they emphasized, or even just a flutter in their eyes while they said it. Like, all of this is, and I don't mean data in this like robotic way of processing, but I just mean in holding somebody in attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
And from my experience, just when you mentioned that sense of curiosity is where I've, even in some big relationships in my life, influential relationships in my life, that I've been able to shift even almost from thin to thick stories about a human being, let alone a wide group of people.
Yeah.
Because unless that curiosity is present, I think we really do hold on to these things rather rigidly.
Yeah. 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 I mean, basically, I would say the reason, so I get asked the question a lot, why do we hold on to thin stories, which are stories that we know are not true, but we continue to perpetuate them? Or we know they're not true of our own children. We think they're true of other children. That's never true. Why do we keep on holding on to it? And it's really because we don't pursue the data that would suggest a thick story. So when Richard Reeves comes out and says and suggests, and I like some of his work, but some of it is really grounded in a misconception here, which is when he calls boys, the way boys are acting, biological. I'm not saying boys don't have more testosterone than girls, but when he talks about boys needing different things social emotionally than girls biologically, that's just not listening to the data. That's telling a thin story that has no empirical root to it. And in a culture that doesn't only, is a little bit, right, growing, so actually anti-science, but certainly anti-soft science, um, Richard Reeves and others like him that make that argument, it's a very common argument these days, somehow think that they're just arguing with me about opinions rather than, I'm not, as I always say, I'm not articulating my opinion. I'm articulating what boys have taught me over almost 40 years about what they need, what they want, right? What humans want, and their emotion, extraordinary emotional capacity to have those relationships. So to me, it's, if we took soft data, meaning word data, I'm being a little bit facetious by making it so extreme, but I want your audience to really hear this. Data based on what people said, we wouldn't tell so many thin stories. Once you privilege numbers over words and you're just counting, you end up with a lot of thin stories. Because imagine, Mark, I want you to do this for a moment. Imagine I tried to describe you just by counting, and that was Mark. You have two eyebrows, you have one set of lips, you have one nose, you have 75, a little bit of gray hairs in your hair.
A
um,
lot of gray
uh,
hair.
but the point is that imagine that's out, and that's essentially what psychology has been doing for a couple decades now, is it's counting. And I'm not saying counting doesn't count, because counting can tell us a lot. Counting can tell how many friends you have, that's meaningful. How many times you've been married, or whatever it is, or how many children you have, that is meaningful. I'm not being I'm not flipping the hierarchy.
No, no,
I use
understood.
numbers in my research too. I do lots of statistics. But I'm just saying, we have to value words and numbers together, and they tell a thick story together, the words and the numbers. And by the way, if you only used words, that would also lead to thin stories, because then what you said, Mark, was true, I would say is true of everyone. And yet one person can't tell us what's true of everyone. So, you know what I mean? Words and numbers work together to tell a thick story.
Just just really curious, and just in the sense of how you mentioned the the sense even of crossing lines, even if that was in
Yeah,
even before you even went to Stanford,
yeah,
and then at Stanford as well. What was the experience like of actually going into then, even whether it's was based on class, on race, whatever it may have been?
yeah,
And as you said, you didn't do anything magic. You simply asked a question, and then
yeah,
and you listened to stories that weren't being told.
yeah.
What was that experience like for you? Was it was there elements to it that were surprising, or what was the general sentiment you were
Yeah,
experiencing while
well,
going through that?
Well, first of all, remember, it always depends on your family. So my family is a multicultural and multiracial. So I have been always from the beginning, when I was a little girl. And remember also, I was born in France. So I've always been in immersed in people from different cultures and from different perspectives and from different viewpoints, and
Right.
sometimes of different races. So it wasn't, and definitely, if you live in Oberlin, classes is, there's lots of poor and working class people in Oberlin, and middle upper class people too. So, and there's one high school, you know what I mean? There's not multiple high schools, there's one high school. Everybody goes to the same high school. So you have much more, you're much more fluid, going across lines in Oberlin than in a place like Stanford, where it's basically complete, when I was growing up, completely homogeneous. So to me, it was going into the homogeneity that was more of a shock than
Hmm.
going into schools that are very diverse, because the homogeneity was, to be honest with you, Mark, it really was shocking. I didn't know communities like that existed, because I had spent most of my life either in Paris or Oberlin or New York City. So I didn't know that there were these isolated, they're not so isolated, but you know what I mean, like incredible homogeneity in one community. So, but also the second thing is, so it wasn't that surprising to me, or different in some ways. But also, I came in with a sense of righteousness, and I don't know where I got this from, probably from both my parents. It's really true. And also my mentor, Carol Gilligan at Harvard, which I have to say, I met her later in life, but um, I definitely have always had a sense of righteousness, and the whole thing of people not being listened to and stereotyped negatively. I felt it about myself as a girl. I felt it about in some ways, well, mostly around my gender identity. I felt being negatively stereotyped, and then also seeing the people around me whom I love being very negatively stereotyped, in all sorts of ways. Um, and including my mom, who was a female faculty at Oberlin College, one of the only female faculty at the time. And so I was out in some ways, Mark, I was outraged that we were
Right.
continuing to tell stories about people that weren't true, that was actually dehumanizing. And so when I went into these schools, I was out to tell a story that humanized, right, kids from urban contexts that we were just saying are getting pregnant at the time or in high risk behavior. We weren't seeing them as full humans. And that came from my own experience of being dehumanized. And it also came from just seeing it around me, certainly in Oberlin, and then definitely in Stanford, in the high school in Stanford I went to.
Do you know, there's something, and I just, even when you were mentioning there, I think I do have a tendency to lean more into the importance of kind of qualitative conversations and
Yeah.
words than numbers.
Yeah.
And so it's a limitation of my own present view, if you know what I mean, of
Yeah. Yeah.
not
No, it's not a
not
limitation.
devaluing numbers, but
Yeah.
putting more importance elsewhere, I guess. But just there does seem to be a real sense, though, if we do break people down to numbers, like it's almost what keeps us apart. It's what keeps us,
Totally.
you know,
Totally.
like it strips out the nuance or the complexity
Yeah.
of what it is to be a human in general,
Yeah.
let alone in any kind of substrata
Yeah.
or socioeconomic group or whatever it may be of society.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's basically it perpetuates a thin story. I want to keep with thin because thin to me represents exactly what it is, which is it's thin. Because sometimes it's not necessarily a false story. So, do boys? I'm going to be silly for a second, but I'm going to make a point. Do boys and men sometimes act like assholes? Yes, sometimes they do. Right? Are they almost always the people that are shooting people up? Yes, they are. Right. So those are stereotypes. And yes, and do women sometimes undervalue their intelligence and act, act unintelligent? Yes, sometimes they do that. So I'm not, thin stories are not necessarily untrue. They're just thin, which means they just report what you see rather than understanding why are they acting that way. Why are men acting like assholes? Why are men killing? Why are men killing each other and girls and women? Why are they? I mean, to get to the point where we're asking, where we're moving beyond with this mass shooter thing that's really got me riled up because we keep on telling a thin story about it rather than what's wrong with this kid. I can tell you right now, I'll tell you what's wrong with him. He's mentally ill and deeply isolated and has probably been bullied most of his life. But that's not why he killed, because there's lots of bullied kids who don't kill, and there's lots of lonely kids who don't kill. It's living in a culture that basically doesn't care, right? Doesn't care about caring, that doesn't care about listening with curiosity to each other, to see each other's needs, that's only focused on the me, me, me. I mean, we're so crazy focused on the me at this point. We all don't feel listened to. We're all out to get people to listen to us, but nobody's listening. And I'm exaggerating to a slight bit, but if you start listening to people, almost 80% of who I talk to, maybe even 90%, don't feel listened to. But they don't hear that the solution is not to just keep on talking more. It's to actually begin to listen to others who will then become more willing to listen to you. And by listening, and this is even though you're doing so beautifully listening to me, I can tell from your eyes that you're closely listening. I would argue listening isn't just not talking, it is also doing exactly what you do in this podcast, which is actually asking follow-up questions to get at more of the meaning of what I'm saying, which then the experience, Mark, when you do that, which is why I keep on smiling, is because it makes me feel seen. It makes me feel heard. It makes me feel like you're listening, right? And if you were totally silent for this whole interview, I would actually wonder whether you were really listening. I would wonder whether you're now sort of meandering off into thinking about something else. And we oftentimes are, right? When we don't ask questions and stay engaged. So I do think it's listening is key, but also with curiosity, meaning everything that comes out of my mouth. This is how I train my students. Everything that someone says, you should be able to have a question with it. Now, will you ask it every time they say something? Probably not. But every time someone talks, you should be thinking, what do they mean by that? Oh, what do they mean by that? How do they think that? Well, why do they think that? Where did that come from? So that you're constantly in your head buzzing with questions, and then you're picking one that feels most pressing for you to then follow up. And we just don't do it. 5-year-olds do it. 5-year-olds do it. I'm going to do a podcast someday in my life, I hope soon, called "How to Act Like a 5-Year-Old," because the idea, right? Because the idea is, and you're going to be one of my first people I interview, Mark. Because, no, because what I'd love to do is really pick your brain around how you got to make this podcast, because that's what the question in my, how did he come to this podcast? Why is he making this podcast? What is he trying to understand in his questions? Like, I'm constantly doing that as you're talking. And so the idea is that thin stories come out of not valuing the curiosity, not valuing listening, and being totally, totally self-absorbed. And also, I think being so many of us are just so unhappy, you know, and
Yeah.
and when you're depressed, it is very hard to care about somebody else. It just is. And
Which it does bring me to something I just wanted to maybe ask you about, even when I was starting to read your book, the overall idea of mental health within a culture, and the idea of just treating one person, not the overall wider culture, but treating
yeah,
the person, people individually. But just something you said there, what stuns me about so many of our interactions, and particularly with mobile phones, that's something I've got into the habit over the last number of months, especially of not even bringing my phone out with me,
yeah,
because there's so much going on in a conversation, like you're alluding to there.
yeah,
And just when you mentioned that idea of, would I even perceive me to be listening if I did not, if I just stayed in silence?
yeah.
I host these conversations that are based around just silence in groups. So it could be for 15, 30, or 45 minutes. And then we just express from what occurred in the silence. No stories about ourselves or anything like this. But one person mentioned once, it's not talking that breaks the silence, it's an agenda. And for me, there's something about that, like that
Yeah,
there's a, and this is what makes me a little bit sad about the modern world, in the sense of just how we're communicating,
yeah,
because very few things make me feel more alive than standing at the edge of the conversation. Like, I'm going to
yeah,
ask a question based on what you've just said,
yeah,
or that links in some way to what you've said. And I honestly think that it's such a big significance. There was even a guest at the end of one of these podcasts that reflected something back to me about the experience, even just like you've done there. So
yeah,
even in your noticing, I feel deeply seen. Do you know what I mean? Just by
yeah.
it. And that's such a kindness, or that's such a connector, would seem so kind of absent or almost bereft of our typical ways of engaging.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think I want to bring it back to the boy culture, hard over soft, because because it's so critical that we see technology is just an expression of that boy culture. That's how we're using
Yeah.
it. So knowing, I'll give you an example why how I'm going to link it to what you just said. So knowing is privileged over asking. Being right is privilege over learning something new. Even in our science, Mark, I'm going to blow you away again. Even in our science, remember, our science is based on hypothesis testing, which is actually knowing, thinking this is what I'm going to find, and then you can only publish it if you're right. I mean, think about it. The foundations of science is anti-curious. It's not about no. I mean, think about it. It's so deep. So the reason why we do that, the reason why we do have all these negative practices that actually hurt connection, is because we're privileging in our heads, what we have deemed hard over soft, which is knowing over learning, knowing over asking, being right. I mean, that sense that you have to know, and we do that in education too, of having the answer is the not, rather than having a question, having good questions, right? Having questions that follow what someone just said. My students have a hard time doing that. They popcorn questions, and I'll say, no, ask a question that relates to what somebody else just said. And they'll say, oh, what did someone else just say? And I'll say, exactly. I mean, and even acknowledging you in the interview, Mark, it's such an obvious thing. I'm staring at you and we're
Yeah,
talking.
yeah.
And so, even I don't do it consciously, but since you brought it up, I'll talk about it consciously. I'm looking at you, and I want people to be in their bodies when they're listening and thinking about themselves. So oftentimes when I'm talking to someone, I direct the conversation about them, because you're looking at me, and so that brings them right into the conversation in ways that if I start talking about my research at this point, I may lose you a little bit. because you're now already thinking about yourself and your own experiences in the world, right? And I know that. So I'm bringing you into it so you can see you're a part of what I'm saying. And I do this. The reason I bring in myself in that book, by the way, is not because I like to talk about myself. I actually don't particularly like to talk about myself. But I want people to see that I'm talking about me too. I'm not just talking about others. I'm talking, or the boys. I'm talking about me. I'm talking about you.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's what 5-year-olds do. I mean, I hate to keep on going back to that, but it's so fascinating to me. It's what 5-year-olds do. 5-year-olds look at your face and they say, "Why are you smiling when I know you're feeling sad?" That's a 5-year-old boy question. Why do you smile when you're feeling sad? Like, they're looking at, how kids look at you. They look at you, they read your face. They read the ambiguities, the contradictions in your face, and then they ask about it. A 5-year-old boy said, another 5-year-old boy said, "Mommy, are you yelling at me because your mommy yelled at you?"
Whew.
I mean, come on, Mark. I mean, we're
Yeah.
born with such remarkable intelligence, emotional, relational intelligence, and then we become less intelligent as we get older, living in a culture that doesn't value both our hard and our soft, our thinking and feeling, autonomy and connection, stoicism and vulnerability. We have to value both sides of our humanity to be a full human. And I just want to say, I say this a lot, but I'll say it again. Growing up in a culture that only values one half of our humanity, we shouldn't be surprised that so many of us are struggling with mental health problems, that we struggle with violence, because we're being asked to only express one side of our humanity, and the other side is seen as lame, pathetic, needy, right? Soft, which is considered lame. I mean, think about how think about what our ancestors would have said, that we're only valuing this so-called hard side of ourselves. I mean, the history of the world across cultures has always valued our hard and soft sides. That's the history of humanity. And in modernity, in the last century, I would argue, especially in the United States, that then gets generalized to Europe and all around the world, it's the privileging of the hard over the soft. Masculinity, maturity, success, and modernity, are you ready, Mark? All end up meaning the same thing, right?
Right.
Stoicism, not relying on others, self sufficiency, making a lot of money. It's all the same package. And caring about people and not making a lot of money and loving what you do and being gentle and sensitive and warm, right, is considered kind of lame. And that's a brutal society. That's a brutal society. And that's what boys are teaching us. And that's why they're so angry, because they see the problem. They see the problem. And we keep on perpetuating it and blaming them rather than blaming ourselves.
Could you speak more to that sense of they see it
Yeah.
and they're angry? Because
Yeah.
it's something you touched on at the very start of it, and I don't know, that touched something in me where I was like, there's
Yeah.
so much truth to this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so it gives me the chills, the goosebumps to talk about it, because I see it so much in my data. So boys will say things like, "It might be nice to be a girl because then I wouldn't have to be emotionless." And I'm going to repeat that again because I hear this all the time. I mean, we live in a culture where a boy says, and I've gotten lots of boys that say a variation of that. "It might be nice to be a girl because then I wouldn't have to be emotionless." I mean, WTF? Like, are you kidding me? That's the culture we live in, that it might be nice to be another sex, because then I
Yeah.
wouldn't have to be emotionless. And the other thing we get, which is direct from mass shooters, and I'm not going to name him because I don't like to promote a sort of obsession with certain mass shooters. But he's a very well-known mass shooter. He wrote a manifesto, and in it, he wrote a 150-page single-space manifesto. It's so interesting because he's a very psychological thinker, even though obviously mentally ill, and he talks about the roots of his anger. I mean, Mark, I'm just telling you, no, none of the media ever picks up on this. It's in my book. He tells us the root of his anger. And it says, we live in a culture, and he uses the word hierarchy of humanness, which I use in my new book. And I didn't know he used it too. I started to use it, and then I
Right.
saw he used the exact same phrase. We have a hierarchy of humanness where some humans are valued more than other humans. And in his case, the athletes and the tall guys, sporty guys, are valued over the short guys and the kids who don't like sports, the boys. And ultimately, that hierarchy of humanness in his case made him bullied, picked on, isolated, not able to find a friend. Um, and he's angry that nobody seems to care. And he's also angry because in their caring, and this is not against his parents, because his parents actually tried for a long time to really help him, they thought they were caring when they'd move him from school to school, right? Um, I'm not blaming the parents. Parents try to do the best they can, but they've been taught by a culture that if a kid is getting bullied, move them. What do you imagine? I always say to my students, imagine you were being bullied. Imagine you were being, bullied constantly, and the solution was to move you to a different school. What does that say about what's the reason for their bullying? It means it's your fault.
Right.
You need to, rather than saying, oh, no, 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 a kid gets bullied in this school, we're changing the whole school because no kid should be bullied in this school. So the idea is we still believe it's the individual's fault, right? When they murder, I mean, it is the individual's fault and this immediate fault, they killed the person. But we still think individually, right, that they're a loner. I mean, to me, that's a crazy thing. They're a loner. Nobody's a loner. Loners are lonely people. That's all it is. Why are they lonely? Why are we all so lonely? I mean, the idea is that they teach us directly in their writings, social media postings, in the research data, exactly. Mark, I really want to say this loudly because we're not listening. We're just not listening. They teach us exactly why they and we are so depressed. They teach us about why they and we are so lonely, why they and we are suicidal, and why some of them, right, commit mass violence. They teach us directly. They say it. They say, I'm mentally ill, in their own words, because I don't have friendships. I have no one to rely on, no one to share my deep secrets with. If I didn't have someone, I would go wacko. They show us as they get older, remember my research is longitudinal, that they do go wacko when they start to feel isolated and alone and like nobody cares about, none of their peers care about them. So the idea is they tell us directly the root of our mental health crisis, the root of our loneliness crisis, and they tell us the solution, which is listening with curiosity and seeing them as they see themselves rather than as we stereotype them to be. That is the solution. And they're screaming that at us for almost a century, not just in my data, but in data across the century, which I have in the book. Um, and we're not listening. We keep on coming back with the so-called experts who talk about children and teenagers and loneliness and mental health that aren't rooted in the data. It's all rooted in what young people are telling us. I mean, I know I'm repeating myself, Mark, but I just want people to understand that we are missing what young people are telling us directly as to the why we're so suffering, the root of our suffering, and what we can do to solve our own problems. And we keep on not listening because we're convinced that we know more than young people.
What i- what is that? Like, you mentioned earlier, there's a fear potentially in crossing lines, right? Just in being curious about people that you don't necessarily identify with.
Yeah,
The sense then of, do you sense there's a fear in questioning our culture? Like, are we too attached to our ideologies, our sense
yeah,
of
yeah,
what our communities or our nationalities
yeah,
espouse? Like, what do you think is a resistance point?
yeah, yeah. No, I'm, I'm appreciating the breeze coming in because I'm getting all riled up and very, very hot. No, because this is a lifetime doing this, so I'm getting all riled up, and your questions are great. The fear, I mean, I think a lot about fear because so much of our lives are driven by fear, and what are we afraid of? I mean, I actually think all fundamentally, and this is through my data, but also through working with students and also just being human myself. I think the fear fundamentally is a fear of loneliness, a fear of isolation, a fear of being left out, a fear of, you know, not being included. And I think what they're worried about is if you talk to someone who's different from you, they won't see you as you see yourself. They won't value you. So they will further, right? You will further feel different or not belonging to whomever you're talking to. And also, I think I mean, fundamentally, I think it's the fear of not being seen as you see yourself. So talking to someone different, that fear, I think, goes up because you fear that they're going to stereotype you in a negative way, and everybody hates being stereotyped in a negative way. Everybody does. If when you talk to someone who's different but who you've known since childhood, right? And you know that they see you as you see yourself, there is no fear. It really is this sense that if I talk to this person, they won't see me for how I see myself. Going both directions, by the way, right? I mean, going both directions. And also, so that I have to be careful about what I ask because it will be misinterpreted. I have to be careful about what I say because it'll be misinterpreted. And so that anxiety of somehow not being seen. So ironically, it's not actually a fear. Why is that linked to isolation? That's linked to isolation because isolation, I would argue, listening to kids for so long, comes from actually feeling not seen.
Hmm.
It's not actually not feeling connected to others. It's feeling not seen by others. And thus you don't feel connected to them. So you can have, there's a lot of data on this. You can have the most popular kids in school report high levels of loneliness because they don't feel like anybody in their group actually sees them as they see themselves. So isolation, feelings of isolation, sometimes come from actually literally, like the mass shooters oftentimes have literally no peers who they're friends with. But oftentimes, loneliness and feelings of loneliness really come from not feeling like others see me as I see myself, and therefore feeling very internally isolated from the world. So, conversation becomes about, and I'm making it silly only to make a point. Listen to me, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. See me, see me, see me, see me, see me. And both people are doing it at the same time. So it becomes almost what I call parallel play, right? Parallel listening, rather than actually coming together and trying to see you, and then you trying to see me, and then that being the formation of our relationship. So to me, it's an isolation of it's a problem of um, it's a problem of, fundamentally, Mark, it's going to sound like I'm being too simplistic, but I don't think I am. It's a problem of not listening with curiosity.
Right.
Because ultimately, by not listening with curiosity, we become isolated, we become friendless, we become not feeling connected to the world, we become alienated from our society, right? That's what happens. So fundamentally, the tool of resistance, and I argue this in the book, is listening with curiosity. It's beginning to see each other with a sense of wonder. What can I learn about you? But also, what can I learn about me through listening to you,
Yeah.
right? Because when you're talking, Mark, and I hope when I'm talking to you, we're both learning about ourselves, right? As we talk and as you ask questions and you talk, right? Because I'm in the process of this, Mark. When you share anything you say, I'm thinking, oh, wait, like he's had that experience, huh? That's somewhat different from my experience, and thus, and I'm doing that in my head while you're talking, and then I'm asking the next question to see where that goes, right? And you are doing the same thing with me. Now I'm really sweating. Look at this. I have.
What, just even with this distinction between hard and soft, even let's say if we make
Yeah.
ideas of stoic and then if there's curiosity being perceived another way, what gives you hope, or like what gives you even optimism within society itself,
Oh,
like ourselves on a
yeah.
wider cultural
Yeah.
sense, tapping
Totally.
into it? Because what you're saying to me resonates so strongly with my own lived experience,
Yeah.
through even different approaches to life, I'd say, and shifts
Yeah.
even within my own life. And it
Yeah.
just feels like so much common sense. What do you, and I'm not saying that I mean that in the sense of the way when
Yeah.
something's
No, no, I
truthful,
know.
it's
It is
usually
common sense. It
quite
is.
simple. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly.
What, like, is it the kind of typical individual journey someone takes where suffering brings us to a
No, no, no,
change?
no, 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 no. It's because it's the reason I can be optimistic is I'm a developmental psychologist, which means
Right.
I have been listening to children that includes teenagers, by the way. They're all children to me under 25. Um, um, I've been listening for a long time. And so what I'm saying is the optimism comes is that we already have the natural skills within us to solve our own problems. We already have them. We don't need to learn them. We don't need to learn to listen with curiosity. We know from 5-year-olds that we're born that way. We're born with a natural, intense curiosity. So the optimism is that we have it already within us, right? We already have it. We don't need to take a special workshop, right? We don't need to take a special workshop. We don't need to pay money. We don't need to go to, some retreat, although retreats are great. But I'm just saying, we don't need to do it. We can start today, this moment, listening to this interview, right? We can start today. Start looking at each other, listening with curiosity, asking questions of each other. Don't worry about getting your own stuff out there. Hopefully, it goes both ways in a conversation. But if it doesn't, that's okay. You've learned a lot from somebody else, and too bad they didn't learn something from you. But it's okay. But the idea is to start to look at each other. I always start my classes like this. I say, turn to your partner. Now look at this person next to you, not your partners, the person next to you. First of all, I always say this, they always think I'm being really corny, but I want them to do it. Look at how beautiful that person is who's sitting next to you. And they all start cracking up. And I was like, no, I'm serious. Like, look how gorgeous this human being sitting next to you is. Look at them. Just look at them. And they laugh, and then I say, no, I'm serious, do it. No talking, no laughing. Just look at them for a second. I'll just have you do it for a minute. So then they look at them, and then they sort of get into it a little bit, right? Even though it feels super awkward. I said, now you're going to ask them a question, and I usually give them the question initially because it makes it easier. As the class goes on, they get to pick their own questions. And I'll say, ask a question about, that's the question they love to answer, about your name. Or ask a question about what you want in life and why, right? Or the first name ones, they love to tell me a story about your name. Now I want you to listen like you are dying to be their best friend. I want you to listen in that way, which means you're going to listen with curiosity to really come to know them and who they are through their story and learn something about yourself, right? And we have 9 practices that I talk about in the book of how to do that. And I lay it out in the book so your listeners can read it. And then they do it. And this is what happens, Mark. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. This is on the first day of class. I do it every class, but this is the first day of class. I have them go back one side 3 minutes, the other side 3 minutes with the same question, okay? And they have to come to know, they have to listen. I said, don't interrupt. You can ask a question. You can interrupt if you're asking a question, but don't go, oh yeah, I've had the same experience. Don't do it. Don't do it. Just come to know their experience and then ask questions about it. So they do it for 6 minutes on the first class. And I'll say, okay, so how was that? Almost always, I've been doing this for 20 years. Almost always, my students will say, oh my God. Oh my God. And I'll say, what do you mean? What's the oh my God? And he'll say, I didn't know how easy it was. I didn't know how easy it was to come to know somebody else. And I always want to laugh. I don't laugh because I don't want to make them feel bad. But I always want to laugh and say, like, duh. Like, duh. That's what we do, we humans. Listen to 5-year-olds. They're constantly bombarding us with questions. That is natural. And then what's beautiful, Mark, which I have to say, because I know we're over time, but I really want to finish this. I really want to finish this thought. What's also beautiful for people who are neurodivergent and kids who are self-identified on the spectrum is I will have a lot of them, because I have a lot of students that self-identify with that. I've been teaching forever, so a lot of students who self-identify as being on the spectrum. They will say, I can't believe that I have the skills to make meaningful connection already. I already have the skills. And that always makes me cry, Mark. It always makes me cry because they didn't know they had the skills. They're natural skills. Everybody has them. Everybody has them. And I will have kids who are very isolated, unfortunately, mostly guys, because that's how it works, unfortunately, in our culture. A lot of young men who are very isolated, and they will come to me and said, you mean I could ask these questions that you get us to ask each other in class? I could ask them with other people like my roommates? And I'll be like, yeah, totally. Just ask them. And they said, well, that's awkward. I said, well, tell them that your professor told you to ask them, and then it will feel easier. And so they do. And I've had this goofy, Mark, but I can tell you, since I've been teaching this a long time, I've had best friends come out that are still best friends, 15 years later. I've had marriages come out of my classes. I've had tons of amazing stories of people who meet in my class. And really all I do in my class is I get you to use your 5-year-old capacities to actually look at each other Also, I love the way 5-year-olds also look at you. They never, you know what I mean by the way they look at you, the way they take you in. They oftentimes, when they're talking to you, like I have a mole under my eye here. I get questions, nobody ever notices that mole, grown-ups don't, but kids always notice. And they'll say like, oh, you have a mole under your eye. Why do you have a mole under your eye? I love that question. I love that question. Like, why do moles grow on your face? I mean, it sounds like parents will say that's a rude question. I love that question because it's a genuine question. Like humans are funny animals. We have funny
Yeah.
things on our faces. So my point is that we have this natural sense. And so just start today. After you listen to this podcast, I'm giving you a
An
dictum for,
assignment.
for all your listeners. Okay, this is it. This is it. I want you to go listen. Stop the podcast when it's over, and then I want you to, whoever's around you while you're listening, or the next person you see, I want you to ask them a genuine question, a question that really comes from the heart. Don't make it a trauma question. Make it tell me about what joy means to you. Tell me about a moment in which you felt joyful. What makes you happy? What do you want? What was fun today? When did you laugh? When did you last laugh? Make it joyful questions. People love to be asked joyful questions. Ask a meaningful question just have asked that person, and then really try to get at their experience of joy or fun or laughter or whatever you want, trust. And then hopefully, if they don't, that's fine. Hopefully then say, well, why don't you ask me those questions too? And then have it go both ways. So then a connection can be made. Just do it. Just start to do it with everybody you see. And your life will be changed. I promise you, it'll be changed. Because all of a sudden it shifts the focus from me, right? You know what I'm going to say, to the me in relationship to you, in the we, which isn't a we with no me. It's a me with a we, right? It's a me with a you, which is the we. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah,
It's the
yeah, yeah.
me with the you.
That answer had me just smiling, both inside and outside the whole way through, and I couldn't agree with it more, even from my own experience in life. That it's so, as I couldn't agree more. You don't have to go away on retreats. This is literally available to you the next time you meet another human.
Yeah,
And if even if you don't do it then, you still have another opportunity that will most likely come around within moments
yeah.
again. So I found that to be absolutely glorious.
And that's
Just
and
conscious,
that's the meaning of a meaningful life. That's the meaning of a meaningful life, of a good life.
yeah,
What's your thing? That's the meaning of a good life. That's the meaning. That's it. I just told you.
just simple as that.
Well, I think the meaning of what is a good life, to answer your question, what is a good life is leading a life that is, let me get this right, leading a life that is constantly enriched by what you learn from others about them, but also about yourself. So leading a life that is constantly enriched through the experiences of others, but not just about learning about them, right? But learning about yourself through others. And this is the kicker, because this is what leads to connection. And seeing yourself in the other. When you begin to see yourself in the other, that is a good life,
Oh,
right? Right? Because it
that's
connects
absolutely
you to your
gorgeous.
common humanity. It connects you to your common humanity. And that is the meaning of a good life.
What when you say that, the thing that comes up for me is just there's so often we're trying to hide these things that connect us, like that ultimately show that we're experiencing so much of the same human experience. And I love, you know, when you kicked off this, it was with the question of what does it mean to be human, is almost a question that you were exploring from your teens to the various experience you've shared, to the classroom just now, to the constant questions, or the sense of crossing lines. And yet the meaning of these experiences, not just in the what I find out about you, what I find out about me, what I
Yeah.
find out about we.
Yeah.
I think that's an absolutely gorgeous response to the question of what is a good life. So Niobe, look, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah. It was so
I've
lovely.
really enjoyed it, and I look forward to continuing to follow your work. And yeah, thank you for so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us here
Thank you,
today.
Mark. Yeah, no, and by the way, I wanted to say this, and I hope you get this in the podcast. Um, I felt seen in this interview. And when I feel seen, and this is true with everybody. I'm more articulate, and what I would say smarter when I feel seen, because my full capacity to express myself gets revealed, and that's true with all humans. And so I felt, thank you, Mark, for allowing me. Right? No, no, I'm going to start that again. Thank you, Mark, for seeing me. And then this led to this great interview. So I really appreciate it.
Niobe, thank you so much for that.